It's okay. The title for our next session is The Past is a Foreign Country. How does history inform fiction? The speakers for this section are H.M. Naqvi, Pran, Nevile, and Shehnaz Ijazuddin. And the moderator for this session is Framji Minwalla. Framji Minwalla is currently the chair of the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at the Institute of Business Administration, Karachi. His research interests include performance, literature and history, visual and cultural studies, theater and politics, media and film, and all forms of theory. Dr. Minwalla was awarded a BA by the University of Michigan and an MFA and DFA both by the Yale School of Drama. Over to Framji, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists before we begin. On my immediate left is Pran Nevile, who really needs no introduction. He's a well-known Indian author and cultural personality. Pran Nevile was also a diplomat and UN advisor. He was born and educated at Lahore. An art historian, he is an acknowledged specialist on the Raj and has also served as a consultant for 2 BBC films. He has authored several books, and some of his well-known titles include Lahore, A Sentimental Journey, Norch Girls of India, Beyond the Veil, Marvels of Indian Painting, and K.L. Saigal, The Definitive Biography. He has compiled and edited Tribune 125 Years, an anthology, and India Through Americanized 100 Years Ago. On his left is Shehnaz Ijazuddin. Writer Shehnaz Ijazuddin lives in Lahore. Her articles have been compiled and published under the title Lost from View in 1994. More recently, she has published an English translation of the famed Dastan Tilisme Hoshruba, in which she has compressed 7 volumes of Urdu text into one single handy volume. Her fluency in Urdu and English and familiarity with Persian give her work a unique authenticity, evoking the late Intizar Hussein's compliment that she had in her translation recaptured the spirit of the original in her thoroughly readable version. And on my right is H.M. Naqvi. Hold on 1 second. Where's your bio, son? Here we go. H.M. Naqvi is the award-winning author of Homeboy, published by Random House in 2009. The debut was hailed as a remarkably engaging novel that delights as it disturbs by the New York Times, and as a genre-busting, page-turning book that fuses slang, literary discourse, pop culture, and politics, history and comedy, East and West, by Lee Siegel. It has been translated into German, Italian, and Portuguese and was awarded the DSC Prize at the Jaipur Literature Festival in 2011. Naqvi has worked in the financial services industry, taught creative writing at Boston University, and run a spoken word venue. He has appeared on CNN, BBC, Bloomberg TV, and National Public Radio, and written for Forbes, Caravan, and the Global Post on a variety of subjects. He is completing his second novel, a big, bad comic epic set in Karachi. He can be found at HM Naqvi, on Twitter. Is that a Twitter? Yeah. On Twitter at HM Naqvi. Welcome everybody, welcome panelists. The title of our panel today is The Past is a Foreign Country, How History Informs Fiction. And the central notion of the panel, the central ideas that the panel wants to get at is how, in fact, history works its way into fictional narrative, how historical narratives actually structure in some ways our experience of and understanding of fiction, and how perhaps even fiction informs history. So, Hussain, how would you say that history in this context, in your work even, informs fiction?
You know, they say that the news is the first draft of history. I would posit that fiction is the second draft. Literature plays a function in discourse that complements reportage, complements historical analysis. So, for instance, today, 70, 80 years after World War II, the British seem to be obsessed with the Great War. If you, at a cursory glance at the Booker Award winners in the last 10, 15 years, yields books that include Pat Barker's The Ghost Road, The Remains of the Day, Graham Swift's Last Orders, and other historical fiction like Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. So, in order to make sense of this historical shock, the British continue writing about the past. And one could argue that to understand World War II, it is necessary to read literature to make sense of it. There's books like Catch-22 and The Sun Also Rises, books that deal with how history has informed the British consciousness. On the other end of the spectrum, there are the Americans. Americans seem to be devoid of a past. The great American writers, contemporary writers like Don DeLillo, Richard Ford, Moody, Franzen, write about contemporary issues, issues that don't have much resonance outside the States. We perhaps lie somewhere in between. Pakistani fiction, particularly Urdu fiction, has been very engaged with who we are, where we've come from. Kurutulain Haidar's Aag Ka Darya is a magisterial sort of sweep of the history extending back into antiquity, into the sort of antiquity that goes back to the Mahabharata and the Gita and the Ramayana. Abdullah Hussein's Udas Naslein deals with partition. I don't think that you can get a sense, a meaningful sense of partition, of independence without reading Udas Naslein. Manto, of course, has also set many stories in and around that period. And then as far as Urdu goes, Kai Chand The Sare Asma, which is Farooqi's book, take on 1857. So Urdu fiction has engaged with our particular peculiar history. English fiction, so far, I don't think we've produced a great historical novel. And that may be because there's so much to contend with in the present that we may not have time to go back. But I think it will happen. I think that who we are is a question that contemporary Pakistani writers deal with. My next novel is set in Karachi. Karachi is a city unlike Lahore. Lahore's history extends back 3,000 years. As you know, Mr. Neville and Begum Ajazuddin are aware of, the Lahore is said to be founded by Lord Ram's son Law. Karachi's history extends back perhaps 300 years. And so there is this vacuum because Karachi is a new city and we have not yet made sense of it. In my next novel, I had difficulty drawing on primary source material. I had to draw on oral histories, which made the project very interesting because I would walk down the street in parts of Karachi that I'm unfamiliar with. My Dadyal hailed from a part of the city known as Paposh Nagar. My Nanyal hailed from a part of the city that's known as Nomaish. But I don't know Garden or Metroville or Gadap Town. So in Garden, I would walk around, for instance, the street and come across houses that were 100 years old and ask the children playing outside who lives there, and would try to enter these houses and talk to families about Karachi of yore. And as a novelist, I find it imperative to engage with reality, engage, and in this case, engage with history in a meaningful way. I, however, am not writing the great Pakistani historical novel, but history plays a very important role in my next work.
Pran Sahib, you have written a number of texts that are specifically historical relative to India. I wouldn't necessarily call them popular history, but they delve into India's past and into Lahore's past and attempt to give us a narrative account of those specific subjects in Lahore, A Sentimental Journey, in The Nautch Girls of India. You've tried to, in some ways, recapture for us the lived experience of that place or of those people, and in the process, almost, when reading those texts, they almost feel like we're reading fiction. Would you like to talk about how, in fact, fiction and history work in your writing?
I think study of history is very important for fiction. Study of history is very important for fiction. For any fiction, you have to have a location, you have to have characters, you will have episodes. They are related to the past, not the future. As Iqbal said, जो था नहीं है, जो है ना होगा, यही एक हर्फ मुजरिमाना. करीब तर है नमूद जिसकी, उसी का मुश्ताक है ज़माना. So the past has its own role to play in fiction writing. And without that, you can't write fiction. Historical facts, you have to have a location of a place, as Mr. Naqvi rightly observed, that he had to go to those parts of Karachi which he was totally unfamiliar. So, the study of history plays this for fiction. I think it's very important to have. So far as I am concerned, in my book on Lahore, I have narrated episodes, well, mostly true to life, but I have fictionalized them to make it more interesting for the readers. So that is the fictional part in my episodes in my Lahore book, although they are related to true events, but to make it interesting, I have made it fictionalized. So fiction and history, they have to be blended together sometimes to create interest for the readers. And that is why I say in my other books on the Nautch Girls and other art, his Raj books, you see, my first book on love stories from the Raj, it is based on my research into all those documents, journals, and historical diaries, travelogues. I pulled out from there and wrote. For everything else also, if I write about my memoirs, I recall the events which I saw, and there is almost every time I fictionalize it to make it interesting. So I think history and fiction are interrelated, very important.
Shanaz? In the Tilism, would you say that there is a kind of informed historical sensibility in this magical, epic, fantasy adventure story? Or does it come just fully formed from the mind of the author, imaginatively, and has no historical sensibility about it?
Thank you, Framji. The Dastan to which you're referring, which is an epic magical narrative tradition in Urdu literature. And in fact, this was our literature a sort of pre-colonial, freewheeling literature, and it's not the kind that is written today. But I think it's very interesting to read it because it explains a lot about ourselves. So, for instance, in the Dastan of Amir Hamza, the protagonist is the main character, Amir Hamza, who is this absolutely chivalrous and brave hero, is also actually the uncle of the Prophet, peace be upon him, Hazrat Hamza. The actual identity of Hazrat Hamza was used, and it was grafted on to this fictional character of Amir Hamza, who has this fantastic life. He is born in Mecca and then taken on as a ward by Noshirwan, the other legendary Persian king, and then goes on to fight Noshirwan's enemies and even the Paris and the jinns of Kokaf, and goes off to Sarandeep in India and so and so. And then right towards the end, after leading this fantastic life where he's been imprisoned by a fairy in Ferila in Kokaf for 14 years because she's in love with him, he comes back and then he's summoned by his nephew, the Prophet, and then he comes back and his death is identical to Hazrat Hamza's death in Makkah. So, there is this amazing blend of fiction and fact, and which you're supposed to swallow, and which of course you do, because the rest of the narrative is so fascinating. So that's just one example of history into fiction.
So it seems that all three of you agreed that, in fact, in order to write fiction, one has to have an informed historical sensibility about the subject and the location and the sensibility the sensibility of the time in which you set your work, and at the same time, would you think that it is slightly dangerous to present, say, historical work blended with fiction, as if, and then present that as if it is the truth, quote unquote, or is it perhaps what we do all the time in the way in which we think historically? Is our historical thinking already always fictionalized because we never remember accurately, or nobody remembers accurately?
I agree with you. In the case of Dastans, it's very specific. Dastans are in a time and place of their own. So one has to read them with an open mind. But I think it does say a lot about our psyche when you read these epic magical narratives. Because, for instance, history is so extraneous to the whole narrative in a way. They're talking about people as Muslims, Muslim heroes, and this is before the advent of Islam. So there is this paradox there, where it's assumed that these people were Muslim all along, and they have their own standards. They drink wine, and but their only condition is that they want to be served by Muslim wine boys. So I think that kind of paradox has crept into our lives as well. They are pretty magical in their own way. So we are expected to swallow a lot of fiction about our own historical characters and personalities in this country.
Pran Sahib, would you say that?
As rightly said, our characters in fiction, sometimes they are true historical characters which we fictionalize. We draw inspiration from all those historical past and the characters and those whatever we have read about them and recreate the same characters with fictional names and also different environment, different surrounding. But the interest, the story element, the fictional element which delights the readers, the author takes care of that, and he blends history and his own fictional to such an extent he wants the reader to feel as if it is more real than reality what his fiction is. So this is an art of the novelist, art of the fiction writer, to make it sound, make it appear as if it's a true fact. It is just like any other historical fact.
Okay. So would you say that the good novelist should also be a superb historian, and the good historian should also have the sensibility of a good novelist, fiction writer?
There are plenty of novelists that disregard history. One of the greatest Russian novels is, of course, War and Peace, which is set on the periphery of the Napoleonic Wars. But then there's also somebody like Vladimir Nabokov, who wrote about an old man falling in love with a prepubescent girl. So Nabokov, the weight of history was on Nabokov's shoulders. He left Russia. His family was white Russian, and they were compelled to flee during the communist revolution. But you don't find much history in Nabokov's novels. So I don't think there are such, I don't think it's necessary. But as far as sort of your earlier query about history and fiction, I mean, you could argue that history is a sort of fiction. Somebody more intelligent than I has said, truth is fiction is a lie that tells the truth, and lots of history is actually invented history. History in the subcontinent is a very fraught exercise. Historiography has been a very fraught exercise. We have, for instance, in the past, created this paradigm that pits Akbar and Aurangzeb against each other. We have deified the likes of Gandhi and Jinnah and Nehru while neglecting Ambedkar and Chandra Bose. And so we have fictionalized history collectively because there's much at stake. Our sense of identity, the nation state, is contingent on a certain historical reading. Our reality is a function of historiography, and and as far as history goes, every generation rewrites it. So if you pick up something that was written about the first war of independence, the Sepoy Rebellion, there was a time when it was called the Sepoy Rebellion. Now nationalist historians call it the first war of independence. So history keeps changing, and it's a story that keeps changing, and it's fascinating how these dynamics inform our sense of self.
I wanted to read something, actually, written by a historian. His name is Hayden White. And in the early 1980s, he wrote actually a groundbreaking book in historiography, in how historians make history. It was called The Content of the Form. And he begins the book by talking about narrative. And to talk about narrative is to talk about both fiction and history, because fiction and history are in some ways both narrative, and they construct narrative form. And he says, to raise the question of the nature of narrative is to invite reflection on the very nature of culture, and possibly even on the nature of humanity itself. That to talk about historical narrative or fictional narrative is to talk about the very nature of the humanity itself. And he says this because so natural is the impulse to narrate, so inevitable is the form of narrative for any report on the way things really happened, that narrativity could appear problematical only in a culture in which it was absent. Considered as a as one of the pan-global facts of culture, narrative and narration are less a problem than simply data. As the late Roland Barthes remarked, narrative is simply there, like life itself, international, trans-historical, trans-cultural. So it's, yeah, I mean, so I think partially what all three of you are trying to get at is this sort of very, is that narrative itself, whether it's fictional or historical, and in some instances one can't even differentiate between what is historical, what is fictional, is at the heart of how we explain ourselves to each other and how perhaps we explain ourselves to the world. Is the impulse to write in that way? Pran Sahib, I'll ask you first.
One is conventional history, you see, where normally it is a historical facts about kings, emperors and all that sort of thing. Political history, as you call it. Then there is oral history also, which word of mouth. Then there is history contained in the journals, in the diaries and travelogues of people of any age, and particular age. Now this material is important, historically important, but very few have the time to research and go through those documents and write. I have done it in my lifetime, in my researching in the British Library, for years on in the US Library. So I have been able to write on subjects which were ignored by the conventional historians. Nobody ever wrote about those subjects. How was the matrimonial of the Sahib log in the subcontinent? How did they live? How did they interact with the Indians? All these facts are unknown in the conventional history books, but I have been able to make them available to the readers through my research from other sources. So there is written conventional history, there is oral history, there is history derived from non-historical sources, so as to say. So it is all a vast field, I should say, and each of them can be a source of inspiration for the fiction writer.
Shanaz, when you were compiling your columns into that collection and going through and selecting which to use and which not to use, many of those were written about events or personalities or situations of the moment. But looking back on them, they are in fact a record of a kind of history, a kind of historical record of a period that you were. How would you describe the process of sifting and then choosing? And would you say that those columns in some ways accurately reflect those historical moments, or that they accurately reflect the things you thought at that time but no longer?
You're right, they did reflect those times, but they reflected, they were very personal. And whether it was historical or political comment or social comment, it was obviously done from my point of view. But I find that the ones that have endured are not the ones that I wrote on the issue of the day, but the ones in which a certain amount of history was involved, whether it was personal history or travel history or any other kind that was related to me. And but there was just one point, since we are talking about history in fiction. It always, Hussain was talking about the great writers like Abdullah Hussain and Quratulain Haider, of course, whose River of Fire, Aag Ka Darya surpasses anything, as not as historical fiction, but just as fiction that informs us about history. But I don't know whether, I'm sure many of you are familiar with contemporary Pakistan popular fiction or plays. And I find it very interesting that whereas, we are living in the eye of a storm and we are living through very interesting times, our fiction, or what is popular fiction, or novels, in Urdu at least, do not reflect any of that. So when you read these books or see the plays, you're only aware of very tame domestic dramas. And I don't know whether it's something to do with the fact that we are living in these turbulent times and therefore we do not want to be reminded of the history that is being played around us. And probably in a few years' time, we may be objective enough to include this in our fictional narrative.
And you're saying in the Urdu fiction and the Urdu dramas, or
Yes,
across?
absolutely. The
Yeah.
Urdu, of course, even in, I'm not that informed about Pakistani English fiction, but even that is quite wrapped up with the self, not so much of the times that we are living in.
Growing up, I watched Varis, which was sort of this great play set in the Punjab,
Yeah.
dealing with these landowners and the dynamics that Vaderas and the dynamics, these socio-cultural dynamics. Today, the most popular play is something called Humsafar, which is a family drama, which as Begum Jazdeen is saying, it is somewhat divorced from the great political gusts that are sweeping this country. But in America, America has sort of launched several very bloody, contemporary, savage, very savage age that we inhabit. There's no great American novel that is set in Afghanistan or in Iraq, and it's surprising to me. Relatedly, I can tell you I watched a movie by Ridley Scott called Kingdom of Heaven a few years ago. It was set during the Crusades, a period of history that was as bloody, if not more bloody, than our times. It featured this very handsome young man as a crusader who played an elf in Orlando Bloom. Orlando Bloom played in a crusader and was confronted with Salahuddin at the end, and the Kurd, of course, got the best of Orlando Bloom. After I watched this movie, I figured I didn't know enough about the Crusade, so I went to the library and picked out 3 different books from 3 different periods that would help me understand what was going on. So I picked up Runciman's magisterial trilogy. It's an Orientalist kind of approach to history. It is wonderfully readable and has dated very well. I also read P.M. Holt, who used to be at Oxford. He was a historian of Islamic history at Oxford. That was sort of a very dry account, facts and figures of when happened what. The most compelling of the 3 books that I picked up on this subject, more compelling perhaps than Ridley Scott's action-packed Kingdom of Heaven, was Amin Malouf's The Crusades Through Arab Eyes. The Crusade Through Arab Eyes is this, it's exactly what we're talking about. This wonderful narrative where Amin Malouf imagines this young Kurdish prince contending with the first crusade, which was somewhat of an aborted crusade. And for the first time I felt I was there. I could empathize with the protagonist, this young man who doesn't know what the hell is going on. He's 17, he's 18, and suddenly the Franks arrive at his door. And he has to summon the requisite resources to take on the Crusaders. And they just appear from nowhere. And they're bent on pillaging and raping and then continuing down to Jerusalem. So, Amin Malouf's book is one of these sort of seminal blends of historical reimagining, and I would encourage you to pick it up.
Would you say that, in fact, I think one of the most interesting moments in that film, in Kingdom of Heaven, is when the Orlando Bloom character confronts Salahuddin at the end and asks him, what does Jerusalem mean to you? And Salahuddin says, nothing. And then he walks away, and then he turns around and he says, everything. And in some ways, that is in fact exactly the problem of history, right? The problem of narrating history, in that the narrative of history, or the thing that you choose to place emphasis on as an important aspect of history, can mean in certain contexts both nothing and everything. And I think it really depends ultimately on how the narrative of history is told to us, or how the narrative itself is constructed, in the driveway, in the facts and dates and the accounting, the sort of the sort of really truthful accounting, I would like to say, and then perhaps the more interesting or engaged or fictionalized accounting. And it seems to me that we always engage with the fictional histories better, or more avidly, or in a more with more interest than perhaps we engage with the dry histories that we had to read when we were primary and secondary school students. And could you comment on why that might be, Pran, because you do this in your work all the time?
You see, because when you bring the element of fiction, you make it more interesting for the reader. It may be the background, may be historical episode, historical incidents, but when you make it colorful by bringing more interesting things which may be of current importance or even current liking, naturally then fiction becomes more interesting. And to that extent that look at this great film or great play, Anarkali. Imtiaz Ali Taj wrote several decades back, you see. But till today, that fictional, historical or unhistorical novel or play, drama or story sustains its popularity. So much so that so many times people have made films. And for the common man, whether it is historical fact or not, he believes that Anarkali, because the tomb is there in Lahore and all that story built around her character and how Sneen falling in love, everything is a true fact. But historian would say, well, this is only a fiction. So this is something, you see, which you can't give any advice to the readers.
Can I just interject? I watched Mughal-e-Azam recently again, and Mughal-e-Azam ostensibly is about the Mughals and that period and the courts, but it seemed to me that Mughal-e-Azam reflected more on the time that it was made and by the people who made it. तो मुग़ल-ए-आज़म तसव्वुर उस फिल्म में तसव्वुर ये है कि सब मुगल जो हैं वो लखनवी थे, तो वो तंग पजामे पहने, आदाब किए, वो मतलब एक तरह से जायज़ है, एक तरह से जायज़ है, but it's not historically correct. They're Turks who had a very different, and Persianate Turks who had a very different sort of world view. अवध से ताल्लुक culturally जो है वो इतना गहरा नहीं था, और and secondly, I mean, it was made, I believe, in the 60s, and it's also a take on Indian politics and Nehruvian politics. And so ostensibly, yes, it is, Mughal-e-Azam is about the Mughals, but if you look, scrutinize it, there's something else going on, something more interesting.
Well, Mughal-e-Azam is also about the Indian perception of Muslims, which is always in what they call a Muslim social, in which everybody is wearing tang pajamas and doing adab. So, for instance, even in the movie Veer Zara, in which the heroine's father is Hayat Ahmed Khan living in Lahore, he's going around in sherwanis and chust pajamas, and nobody can understand where he's from. But you know, that is something which is entirely Bollywood. But you know about Pran Saab's take on Anarkali, I mean, historians have kept suggesting that she was Akbar's, in fact, one of Akbar's minor wives, and there is that view. But yes, the fiction, not entirely fiction, it will persist, because there is a tomb in Lahore, which is Anarkali's tomb, and there is her grave, and there is that absolutely beautiful verse by Jahangir that is written on it, which goes to the effect of, could I but see your face again before I die? And it was built by Noor Jahan. So, I mean, you know, we lead these very surrealistic lives and have a very surrealistic past.
The one thing which all this fiction proves, and is true, that the Punjabis' beauties were sought after by all the great Mughals to staff their harems.
But she was not Punjabi, bro.
Anarkali was a Punjabi, not of these at all.
She was Nadra Begum and she was Afghani.
She came,
She was one of the first Afghan refugees.
But
in
see,
this
Akbar
area.
was in Lahore. The second capital of Mughal was Lahore.
That's true.
After Agra, Delhi was nowhere. So all these romantic episodes take place in Lahore because the Lahore beauties were irresistible. Not only Anarkali, I have written about it also, that Punjabi beauties, in fact. So this Anarkali, we have made so many films on that, so many films. And then of course Mughal-e-Azam is the last 1960. It was made in 1930s. Then we made it in India in 1953. Then with Noor Jahan, you made it 1958. Compare those pictures, see, scene by scene, it is the same. But it's all based on Imtiaz Ali Taj.
And there you have fiction and history,
Fiction and
all
history.
over again.
So, on that note, I think we should open up the floor to questions. Mike?
I find this very interesting, a discussion that does let you think about the broad human consciousness. I mean, the difference between humans and the rest of creatures is that we have a sense of time. And therefore, I'll put to the panelists the question, which is the title of your discussion: is the past really a foreign country? And I'd like you all to address it. To me, past and present are a continuum, and I think they both interact all the time, as has come out from the discussion. So, do give us your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Past is more important than present. Number one. We enjoy thinking about the past. So much so, क्या जलवे याद आए कि अपनी खबर नहीं, क्या जलवे याद आए कि अपनी खबर नहीं, बिन पिए मस्त हूँ शब महताब में. So past has its own, contribution to your day-to-day life, and you cannot erase your past. Today's news becomes tomorrow's past. Current affairs become history. So past is very important, you see. Of course. That is something for the distinguished Mr. Naqvi to answer the question, because for me there is no such thing as foreign country. You think of yourself, your surrounding environments, and not foreign country so far as past is concerned.
If I may interject, I think it's very relative. When you're younger, the past is not only another country, it's another planet. But as you grow older and you gain more perspective, and you particularly towards your elders, because when you're reaching that stage of life when you remember they were, you realize that there is not that much difference, that people act according to type, that things happen in the same way. It's just that it's a different time. So I think it's a matter of age and experience, really. At least that's what I've observed.
If you think about the title, it's a juxtaposition of the topical and the topographical, time and place. So the past is a foreign country is sort of, you have to, it's metaphoric. So fundamentally, it's difficult to sort of cogently, logically contend with this phrase. But metaphorically, it has resonance. On this stage, for instance, Begum Ijazuddin's husband's family were associated with Ranjit Singh's court. And in a way, that is a foreign country now. It's a different place, it's a different land almost. Nevile Saab, of course, was born in Lahore and now lives in Delhi. And so possibly you can also make a case that Nevile Saab's past is also a foreign country. He may or not agree with me, but if we're talking about this particular title, is unwan pe agar bahas ho rahi hai, to one can make sense. And हमारा ताल्लुक, हमारे ख़ानदान का ताल्लुक यूपी से रहा है, बिहार से रहा है. अब हम बचपन से लखनऊ के बारे में सुनते आए हैं कि गिलहरी वहाँ की, लखनऊ की, यहाँ गिलहरी हाँ सही है, मगर जो लखनऊ की गिलहरी थी, और ये मलमल जो है जो ज़ैनब मार्केट में मिलता है वो ठीक मिलता है, मगर जो लखनऊ में मलमल हम पहनते थे, सर्दियों में हम लोग सीने तान के हम लोग गलियों में घूमते थे, तो ये हमने कहानियाँ सब सुनी हुई हैं. तो मगर जब हमारा लखनऊ जाना हुआ 2003 में, it was a foreign place. It inhabits my consciousness. It inhabits the realm of my imagination. But it's not tangible. It's not a place. So that's how I would attempt to respond to your question.
It's like going to Alexandria, where you have to imagine everything as it was, because nothing of its ancient part survives. So it's the phantom city that you visualize rather than the Alexandria that you see.
Sure.
So,
but for the people who grew up in Karachi before the 1980s, consistently revise in their imagination the Karachi that existed.
Absolutely.
And remember
Absolutely.
that Karachi relative to the Karachi that is now. And the two are really, one is really a foreign country to most people today because very few remember.
Yeah.
And my sense is that we're always revising our past, and we're revising our past in our own image, and that the older we get, that we are constantly looking back and remembering differently and thinking differently about what we remember. And that when to go back and write about the past is a kind of colonization, that we have to colonize the past as a foreign country in order to reimagine it or rethink it or remember it. And I think in those ways, right,
I would like
metaphorically or
to
not,
add,
yeah.
see, every bird returns to the nest, loves to come to the nest. So whether it's Karachi or Lucknow, for me, Lahore, nothing can surpass it. तो हम तो ये कहते हैं मेहरबान हो के बुला लो मुझे चाहो जिस वक्त मैं गया वक्त नहीं कि फिर आ भी ना सकूं.
बहुत अच्छे.
I think, question, we have time?
I will be very quick then. I am from a foreign country, from Norway, and as I get older, I think I'm from another foreign country. But this thing to use history depends what in history do we use. These big events we use all the time. I feel in Pakistan we use them too often. When I talk to students in social sciences, it's too much about that. And then, of course, it's how can we make Pakistan bigger? And people are concerned about that. But I think what is more important is everyday history, the psychology, the folkloristic aspect, all these things. That was what Henry Ibsen and these guys did in Norway when they tried to make Norway or tried to help in nation building of the country. So it depends what we use in history, and and Henry Ibsen's things written 150 years ago, they are modern today.
Right.
Which is interesting, and hopefully when you write, and I agree with all you have said anyway, but you know, when you write about, you use history, but you write about today and you write about the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, over.
Thank you. Apart from, well, I'm Shahid Nadeem, playwright, and I have tried to recreate or correct history according to our circumstances. And my experience has been that we, at least countries like Pakistan, we live in the past, and history is very much part of our present. Most of our conflicts, may it be between India and Pakistan, or Mughal rule, or Shias and Sunnis, or Sufis and Salafis, it all goes back to history. And I wrote a play about Dara Shikoh and the conflict between Dara and Aurangzeb. And I did not have to link it to the present times. The debate is already there, it's raging in Pakistan or all over the world. And the audience were very, very clear, immediately they could relate to it. So sometimes history is there among ourselves, and all we have to do is, because we are condemned to keep on repeating the same mistakes, so sometimes just recreating, at least on stage, I'm not sure about fiction, but on stage, somehow it makes people realize that the follies which they have committed, the wrong turning they did at the time of Dara and Aurangzeb conflict, and the message is there. So history, at least for us in subcontinent, is not foreign at all.
But Shahid Saab, actually, may I ask you a question? So in an interview with The Guardian when they were producing Dara in London, one of the things you said was that in fact Aurangzeb was the first Taliban. And and that accurate or not, that is a way in which we revise our history in order to reflect the present, right? So we're constantly looking at the history from our point of view.
In fact, I would insist that as far as the play which I wrote was concerned, Aurangzeb was given full opportunity to defend himself, and he charge-sheeted himself also in his last letter to his son, in which he said that I did not listen to my conscience and I will be responsible for the destruction of the empire. So he himself convicted him.
Somebody wants to.
I think, do we have? Oh, I think we're actually out of time now. So thank you very much. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank
Framji.
you so much. Thank you, Framji.
Thank you.